Alright, I wanted to make a quick video review of this LG Gram 14-inch. It's got the 12th gen Intel i7 1260p processor in there. It comes with 16 gigabytes of RAM and 512 M.2 SSD. It has two SSD slots, both two 2280 sized M.2 SSD slots. One which comes with one slot has the 512 gigabyte SSD in there, and the other one is vacant. That is upgradable. I had this laptop, this 14-inch LG Gram, which I purchased for $600, alongside a MacBook Air M.2 for an entire week or two, which I had purchased for $950. So I had the LG Gram 14-inch and the MacBook Air M.2 for a couple weeks side by side. It was the M.2 Air with the base model. It was the base model with 8 gigs of RAM and 256 gigabytes of hard drive space. And so I'm going to talk about this in kind of comparison to that, and some of the specifications of both that are relevant, and why I ended up with this one and why I like this one after the 2 weeks of use. So going over the specification of this, I mentioned the 1260 i7 processor, the 16 gigabytes of RAM, and the 512 SSDs. That's also upgradable. It also weighs 2.2 pounds, whereas the MacBook Air M.2 weighs 2.7 pounds. So this is half a pound lighter, and in practice, in use, you can feel that half a pound is pretty impressive how light this is. What's also impressive is this has a 72 watt hour battery, whereas the MacBook Air M.2 has a 52 watt hour battery. And what I think is really impressive about the MacBook Air is that its battery life was out of the box better than this, even with a smaller battery. That just speaks volumes of how efficient the M.2 chip is and the Mac is. However, I got this not as good as, but pretty comparable to that, because I did some tweaks within Windows to kind of restrict or harness or restrain the speed of the i7 Intel processor in here, to make sure it wasn't just sucking a lot of power out of the battery when when this laptop's not plugged in. So the other thing the other specification we should talk about is the screen resolution. The screen resolution on this LG Gram is 1920 by 1200, and the MacBook Air screen resolution is 2560 by 1660. The other thing to note is the LG Grams has a 14-inch screen with 400 nits of brightness, whereas the MacBook Air has a 13.3-inch screen with 500 nits of brightness. In practice, or practically, I couldn't really tell too much of a difference between the 13.3-inch and the 14-inch screen in terms of size. However, the resolution on the MacBook Air is better and was noticeably better, and the brightness was a touch better too. However, in practice and daily use, day-to-day use, I hands down prefer the screen, the IPS 14-inch screen of the LG Gram to that of the MacBook Air, because the MacBook Air screen is glossy, and they do put an anti-reflective coating on it. Nonetheless, that glossiness is pretty annoying, and I found this much easier to use, and I found I got a lot less glare in those circumstances where there would be glare, because of the matte finish on this LG Gram 14-inch. And this is not a touch screen, as you can see, nor is the Mac's. The Mac's not a touch screen either. However, so in spite of the better resolution and the better brightness, I did prefer the LG Gram screen just because of the matte finish and and that it wasn't glossy. All right, moving on to the SSD speed. So the SSD speed on this LG Gram is fantastic, and I'll pull up my speed test here, and I have it on the desktop. So here's the speed test for the LG Gram, and as you can see, for 1 gigabyte of material, it reads at 3,000 megabytes per second and close to 1,900 megabytes a second. And for 1 gigabyte of transfer on the MacBook Air, we can use that as a comparison. Here is the MacBook Air with 512, so we'll revisit that. But the base MacBook Air with 256 gigabyte SSD for a 1 gigabyte test, it was much slower at a write speed of 2,000 megabytes per second and a read speed of 1,400 megabytes per second. And here you can see the comparison to the read speed. Oh, actually the write speed was a little bit faster for the MacBook Air at 2,200 megabytes per second. This write speed was 1,900, but the read speed was much faster at 3,000 and this. But one thing of note is that, remember, this one comes with an SSD that's 512 and it is upgradable. Okay, so the SSD on this laptop is upgradable, and it comes with a Samsung Blue SSD and far superior SSD that's 1 terabyte you can purchase for $50, such as a Samsung 970 EVO will blow these numbers out of the water, and that's going to only be close to around $50, maybe 60 for 1 terabyte. And so that's a moot point. And the fact that this is interchangeable and expandable, I still think, in my opinion, it has the MacBook Air beat. Not to mention you have $350 price savings. Now, if you do upgrade to the MacBook Air's 512 gigabytes, then the speeds are better. Not the read speed. The read speed on the stock LG Gram with only one M.2 SSD is faster than the read speed here, whereas the write speed does have it beat by a good margin. But remember, this is the 512 model of the MacBook Air, and Apple is gonna make you pay $100 to $200 for that upgrade, make you pay through the nose. And the reason the MacBook Air is faster is that it has two, and this is not upgradable on the MacBook Air. It has two 256 chips soldered onto the motherboard, and so it writes in parallel and reads in parallel. So that's where the speed improvements come from. Moving on to battery life. So battery life on this I found fantastic once I did the tweaks within Windows, and I'll show you what I did. It's comparable to the MacBook Air in practice. I can get 2 to 3 days of battery life out of this with the 72 watt hour battery that comes in on this. And what I also find is impressive is how light this is. It's half a pound lighter in spite of it having larger battery. Nonetheless, once I did the tweaks, what I did is I went into power options, advanced settings, and I set the maximum processor state on battery to only be 70%. So the processor would, when on battery, Windows would not allow it to go into turbo mode. And what happens in turbo mode, you get small 10% increase in, I believe, clock speed at the cost of massive amounts, almost like 30% or 50 to 100%, like massive amounts of power consumption. And so I didn't want that to happen while this is running on battery, and so therefore I limit the maximum processor state on battery to 70%. And you can even put that to 80 or 90%, and it'll still limit the processor from going into turbo mode and consuming the massive amounts of power. And as I mentioned, or I may have not mentioned, when I first purchased this laptop, this is an i7 and it does get kind of hot. Another tweak I did to minimize the amount of to improve the thermals, to minimize the amount of fan spinning, is I removed this cover and I replaced the thermal paste that came stock with this with Arctic MX4, which I didn't even check the thermals prior to replacing it, because I always replace the thermal paste on any laptop or graphics card I buy, because the Arctic MX4 performs so much better than stock thermal paste that comes from the factory. And so I did that. Another tweak, and so that helped with the fan speed. What else I did is I opened the LG Smart Assistant here, and I moved the fan speed from high to low. This does have a fan in it. The MacBook Air M2 is all passively cooled. There's no fan in it, which is what I did like that about the MacBook Air M2. Because the M2 chip is so efficient, it doesn't generate much heat. This is a heavy-duty i7 chip, and it does generate quite a bit of heat. But I did set the fan speed to low, and that coupled with the change in thermal paste, I have not had any issues, and I don't get throttling. I'll show you what my thermals are looking like here. Here you can see the temperature currently of the processor is 35 degrees Celsius, and the max I got it up to was 73 degrees Celsius. And so I found that tweak helpful in helping conserve battery life, as well as not having to listen to the fan or having this fan noise at a minimum. What else another tweak I did is I went in and I removed all the bloatware. There was McAfee virus scan and some assistant to help move files or transition from an old laptop to this laptop. I completely removed that software as well. Another tweak I did is I went into the startup apps and I disabled anything I don't use, so it wouldn't start up and be running in the background, consuming resources and battery life. One last thing I did is on the settings over here is I turned off anything I don't use, such as I don't use Bluetooth, and I keep that off. I do leave the wireless on, but I don't have any Bluetooth devices connected to this, and if I do, I can turn it back on. But I leave any radios or anything else I don't use, I usually turn that off. And with all those tweaks, I'm able to get close to 3 days of battery life, easily the 10 or 12 hours that this is quoted. I don't know if I quite get 16 hours, but this is made a dramatic difference in how long the battery lasts on this. And I find it now in use practically comparable to the MacBook Air M2, but the MacBook Air 2's battery life is still better. Another thing I wanted to point out is the I/O, the ports. This is very handy, having an HDMI port right here, as well as two USB ports, the USB-C ports. The MacBook Air does have this. The MacBook Air lacks the HDMI port. It does have a headphone jack, but the MacBook Air lacks to the two USB ports and the micro SD slot. And I found that very cumbersome. In the MacBook Air, I had to go out and buy a close to $100, $30 or $40, sorry, not $100, $30 or $40 USB-C converter, because you got to look at those dongles and make sure you're getting the rated speed out of there. And then you plug that in, and then you'd finally be able to use your USB dongle for your wireless mouse or your thumb drive. Your USB drive, or your micro SD, and that was just super annoying. So when I'm using this laptop, I do not carry the power adapter with me. Because the battery life is so great now, I just carry the laptop, which I mentioned is only 2.2 pounds, half a pound lighter, $350 cheaper, and I carry this around plus a mouse, and I just leave this dongle plugged in. There are Bluetooth mouse options which you can use with the MacBook Air. However, then your mouse choices are so limited, and I didn't want to have to deal with that. So I find it very convenient to have the two USB ports. If if I need to use a USB drive, this is still available alongside my wireless mouse. And if I want to put some files on here, I have a micro SSD port. Also, using an external monitor or using this as a media PC to hook it up to a TV, super easy, which an HDMI port is right there. This charges through either one of these USB-C ports and is fast charging. The MacBook Air M.2 allows you to charge through either the two USB ports or the MagSafe port. So there's flexibility there for the MacBook Air as well. The other thing I want to mention is some critique this got was for the flexibility of the screen. Initially, I thought it'd be bothersome for when typing if it would have too much wobble, but it doesn't, and I don't mind it at all. In fact, I might even, I find it is a slight positive because if somebody bumps into this or I bump into it or drop it, this isn't going to crack my screen. It's just going to flex, and it gives some degree of durability to the laptop, but you can see it is a touch bouncy. Other thing that's nice, it does open with one finger. So some laptops that are this light, LG got that right. So it's you'll have to, when you get there, you'll have to hold it down to open it. This one's not that case. You just can open it with one finger. What else do I want to say? Oh, the keyboard on this, I did prefer this keyboard compared to the MacBook Airs. They're both good, but this one's just slightly probably easier to use. It's not as stiff to push down. Another thing I wanted to say is, in spite of this screen being flimsy on this LG Gram, this chassis portion, or the actual this chassis portion of the laptop is made out of a magnesium alloy, and it's super stiff. There is some keyboard flex in the middle, but not as much as you'd expect, and so this provides a nice backbone to the laptop, and it feels very sturdy. And so carrying it around, there's not any flex carrying it from the corner, nor is there carrying it like this. Obviously, the MacBook Air is just a super solid construction, and the MacBook Air still feels better built and heavier duty than this. However, there's a little bit more to say about that. However, this is half a pound lighter, and I'll take the lighter weight over the premium quality feel of the MacBook Air. Not to mention, I do prefer Windows OS over the MacBook Airs. What else did I want to mention? One last thing I do want to mention is the audio output through the headphone jack. The audio output through the headphone jack, I prefer the sound quality as well as the sound signature of the audio headphone jack on the LG Gram compared to the MacBook Air. The MacBook Air has been doing a considerable amount of marketing regarding the ability to use high impedance headphones with the MacBook Air's headphone jack, but in comparison, this is just as powerful, if not possibly more powerful than the output on the MacBook Air. Even at 20% volume, I'm getting full sound, like almost too loud on the headphones, and I experienced that with the MacBook Air as well. Now, regarding the sound signature, I have a RME ADI DAC that I use as a reference for anything that comes through headphone jacks. And I compared that along with this and the MacBook Airs. The MacBook Air's sound there was a little bit too much treble, and it sounded not as accurate as it should in relation to the RME's reference DAC that I have. And the audio quality on this was not as good as the RME, but the sound signature was more comparable than the MacBook Airs. And the sound quality on this and the MacBook Air were about equal, but the MacBook Air's lows were a little lacking and the highs were accentuated. They were a little bit brighter than reference, which in my case was the RME DAC. I use that as a reference to compare the sound signature of this, which I found more consistent than with the RME than I found the MacBook Airs. So, and I actually went out of my way to compare it to the RME after comparing this one and the MacBook Air side by side A/B comparison with with the same audio track. And I was hearing the differences, and I wanted to know which one was more accurate. To my ear, right away, the MacBook Air sounded more exciting, but something told me that I wanted to see how it would compare to the reference RME DAC, and sure enough, this was more accurate. And before doing that test, I did prefer the output on this compared to the MacBook Air, but because of the marketing, I just wanted to see. I was like, is something wrong with this? Or not necessarily something wrong, did LG really cut corners on this? Is Mac's really that much better? And that's what prompted me to compare it against my reference RME DAC. And I prefer this. I preferred the sound signature to this, and I found it to be more accurate. And I just figured I would mention that since there's quite a bit of advertisement. There's some advertisement done on Apple's end about their ability to use high impedance headphones and all that mumbo jumbo. But that's about it. Last thing I want to mention is that the logic board on here, or the motherboard, everything's soldered to it, and so there's not that many ribbon cables inside. It's all pretty self-contained. The battery pretty much takes up this much of it, and the logic board takes up this much of it. And I didn't find that. And on the MacBook Air, actually, the USB port and the audio jack, they're all on separate chips, which I guess could be a benefit if one of those chips goes bad, or the headphone jack or the USB ports has issues. It would be easy to replace those. Whereas in this one, I don't think it will be as easy. I had a lot of problems with with the laptop that this replaced, which was the X1 Carbon 3rd Gen, with the keyboard and the ribbons falling. I just had a bunch of reliability issues. Nothing tells me that this will have that, but only time will tell. And of course, Mac has great reliability track record. But overall, for the $350 price savings, as well as the double amount of twice as much RAM and twice as much SSD space, that is faster with the cost savings and all the I/O options, and the 0.5 pound, the half a pound weight savings. I found this to be a much better buy, and that's personally for me. If you value the better screen, and you value the battery life, and you value having all of the power for video editing while on battery, then I think the MacBook Air would be a better buy. But I don't video edit on this. I was able to tweak the settings to get the battery life comparable to the MacBook Air in general use, YouTube, watching videos, office work. So, and that weight savings is great. Half a pound is huge. All right, I hope that helped. That's my quick little review of this LG Gram 14-inch. I've been very happy with it, and hope you found it helpful. Thanks.